The alarm went off at 6:50, and for a few seconds Leigh Calloway just lay there staring at the ceiling. Not because she was tired. Because the apartment was quiet in a way that still caught her off guard. Sometimes the particular quiet of a space only has one person in it and always will. The divorce had been finalized 3 months ago. Her ex kept the house. She kept a storage unit worth of furniture, a good professional reference, and enough in savings to cover first and last month's rent on a one-bedroom in the Highlands. It wasn't a bad neighborhood. Tree-lined streets, older buildings, a coffee shop on the corner that she hadn't been inside yet. She told herself she'd go eventually. That was the version of herself she was working toward, the one who walked into coffee shops alone without it feeling like a statement. She'd chosen this neighborhood the same way she'd chosen her new job, for the anonymity. Yes, but also because starting over requires believing at least a little that starting over is possible. Nobody here knew what her marriage had looked like at the end. Nobody at work knew why she'd left her last position. That was the whole point. She got up, ran the coffee maker, and stood at the kitchen window while it brewed. April in Louisville looked gray that morning. The street below was already moving, a man walking a dog, a woman in scrubs heading toward the bus stop, a delivery truck idling at the corner. Life proceeding at its usual pace, indifferent to whoever was watching. The job had come through her friend Wendy, who knew someone who'd heard that Bluegrass Financial Services needed a bookkeeper. 5 people total, 2 offices on the 3rd floor of an aging building near downtown. The kind of place where the elevator worked about half the time and the hallway always smelled faintly of burned coffee. The firm's director, Gerald Pruitt, 53, balding with the permanently preoccupied look of a man running calculations in his head, had looked at her resume for about 90 seconds. Named a salary that was acceptable if not impressive, and offered her the job without asking a single personal question. She had said yes before he finished the sentence. She poured her coffee, drank most of it standing at the counter, rinsed the mug, and left the apartment at 8 on the dot. The bus stop was 3 blocks away. The ride downtown took about 35 minutes, and then it was a 5-minute walk to the building on West Muhammad Ali. She'd done it every weekday for 2.5 months. The route had become muscle memory, which turns to take, which light to cross on, where to stand on the platform, so the doors opened right in front of her. Something about starting over in your mid-30s, it doesn't look the way you thought it would. It looks like a bus schedule and a cup of coffee you drink alone. She walked the same way she always did. Past the corner store, past the dry cleaner, past the entrance to the 4th Street Transit Center, where every single morning without fail, there was an old woman sitting on a flattened piece of cardboard with a small tin cup in front of her. May Hollis had been in that same spot every morning for as long as Leigh had been making this commute. Sitting on a flattened piece of cardboard just to the left of the transit center's main entrance. A small tin cup on the ground in front of her. A handwritten sign propped against the wall that said simply, "Please help." She never called out to anyone. Never made eye contact first. Never extended her hand toward the people walking past. She just sat wrapped in a faded tan coat that had been through too many winters and waited with the patience of someone who had stopped expecting much. That restraint was what had gotten to Leigh on the very first day. She'd walked past, gotten half a block away, and turned back. She'd fished 2 quarters out of her jacket pocket and dropped them in the cup. May had looked up and nodded once. That was it. Leigh had kept walking. But she came back the next morning. And the one after that. Over the following weeks the coins became a habit, and the habit slowly became something else. A few words exchanged. A name. May Hollis, 78 years old. She'd lived in the neighborhood for decades, she said, though she was vague about where exactly she slept now. There was a place she could go sometimes, she said, but she couldn't always stay there. Leigh didn't ask for the details. She knew better than to push at a story someone wasn't ready to tell. She had a few of those herself. So it went morning after morning. Leigh would stop. Drop whatever change she had, sometimes a dollar bill if she'd stopped at the coffee cart, and they'd exchange a sentence or two about the weather or the morning or nothing in particular. It was a small thing. This Monday morning, she stopped as usual. She reached into her coat pocket, felt the coins there, and bent down toward the cup. May's hand moved faster than she expected. Dry fingers, surprisingly strong, closed around Leigh's wrist and held. Leigh looked up. May was watching her with an expression that had nothing to do with age or confusion. It was fear. Specific focus directed straight at Leigh. "Don't go home tonight," May said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You hear me? Not tonight. Sleep somewhere else, a motel, a friend's place, anywhere. Just not there." She paused. Promise me. Leigh tried to ease her wrist back. May held on for one more second, then released her and turned away like the conversation had a natural end that only she could see. Around them the morning crowd kept moving. Nobody glanced over. Leigh straightened up and stood there for a moment, coins still in her hand. She'd given that woman spare change every morning for 2 months. She didn't expect it to matter. She didn't expect any of it. She dropped the coins in the cup anyway and walked to the bus stop. She told herself it was nothing. But her hands weren't quite steady, and they stayed that way the whole ride in. The office was the same as every other Monday. Invoices stacked on the left side of her desk, reconciliation reports open on her screen. The radiator near the window ticking the way it always did when the building's heating system couldn't quite decide what season it was. Leigh sat down, pulled up the first file and tried to work. It didn't take. May's voice kept cutting through, "Don't go home tonight," and no amount of column balancing pushed it out. She went through the motions for a couple of hours, checking figures she'd already checked, scrolling back through entries she didn't actually need to review. The numbers were fine. That wasn't the problem. Around noon, she got up to get water. The cooler was in the hallway just outside her office next to the supply closet. She was filling her cup when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Bobby Crane coming down the hall. Crane was the building's security guard, or Bluegrass Financial's version of one, which meant he sat near the front entrance, buzzed people in, and occasionally walked the floor. He'd been there about 6 weeks. In that entire time, Leigh could count their interactions on one hand. Good morning. Afternoon. Once when the elevator was broken, he'd held the stairwell door. That was the full history between them. He filled his own cup from the cooler and then, without any particular lead-up, asked her which part of town she lived in. Leigh looked at him. "Close to a bus line," she said. He nodded like that answered something. "Long commute, it's fine," she said. He finished his water, set the cup on the edge of the cooler, and walked back toward the front of the office. Leigh stayed where she was, holding her cup with both hands. The question itself wasn't alarming. People asked things like that. "Where do you live? How's your commute? Do you drive or take the bus?" Small talk. Office filler. But Crane had never made small talk with her before, not once in 6 weeks, and there had been no setup, no conversation. It grew out of nothing she'd said that invited it. It arrived from nowhere and led nowhere. That was the part she couldn't file away. At 3 in the afternoon, Gerald Pruitt knocked once and came into her office carrying a manila folder. He sat down across from her desk and pulled out 3 March service contracts, laying them flat between them. He wanted to know if she'd processed these without noticing the client's signatures were missing. Leigh picked up the first one, then the second, then the third. She looked at each page carefully. "These had signatures when I processed them," she said. "I remember because I cross-referenced them against the billing register before I logged them." Pruitt scratched the back of his head. "Maybe I'm looking at the wrong copies," he said. He gathered the folder, said thanks, and left. She sat looking at the closed door for a long moment. It was a small thing, a shrug, a maybe, a polite exit, but there was something in the way he'd held that folder on the way out a little tighter than necessary. Like a man who had gotten the answer he came for and needed to leave before his face gave anything else away. 15 years of bookkeeping. She had never once processed a contract without verifying the signatures. Not once. Either she was wrong about her own memory, which was possible technically, or someone had pulled those pages and replaced them after the fact. One of those explanations required her to distrust herself. The other required her to distrust everyone else. None of it was enough to act on. That's the thing about being gaslit by your own common sense. You keep telling yourself you're overreacting right up until you're not. By the time 6 o'clock came and she shut down her computer, she had 3 things sitting in her chest like stones: an old woman's grip on her wrist that morning, a question about her address from a man who had never spoken to her before, and 3 contracts that she was certain had been altered after she'd already signed off on them. None of it connected cleanly. None of it proved anything. But she walked to the elevator and stood there waiting for it, and she could not make herself stop thinking. She came out of the building at 6 and stopped on the sidewalk. The evening foot traffic moved around her, the way water moves around something fixed, people splitting left and right without looking up, everyone with somewhere to be. Leigh stood there and let it happen. She went through it again. May's fingers around her wrist stronger than they had any right to be. Crane's question dropping into a conversation that hadn't existed until that moment. The 3 contracts on Pruitt's desk missing signatures she was certain she had verified herself. Individually, each one had an explanation. A frightened old woman. Routine small talk. A filing error. She could line them up that way and they amounted to nothing. She got out her phone and searched for budget lodging near Nulu. A hostel came up 2 blocks off East Market Street, $42 for a bed in a shared room available tonight. She stared at the listing for longer than it should have taken. Then she booked it and paid with her debit card before she could change her mind. She texted Wendy, not sleeping home tonight. Tell you later. Wendy's response came back in under 30 seconds. Oh my God, did you finally meet someone? Leigh put the phone in her pocket without answering and started walking. The hostel was a narrow building wedged between a restaurant supply store and a parking structure. The woman at the front desk had the efficient disinterest of someone working a late shift and handed Leigh a key card without ceremony. The room was on the 2nd floor, 4 bunks, 2 sets, no one else there yet. Leigh dropped her bag on the lower bunk nearest the window, sat down on the edge of the mattress, and looked at the wall. The rational version of herself had a lot to say. She was sleeping in a hostel because an elderly homeless woman had grabbed her wrist and told her not to go home. She had paid $42 and would spend the night in a room that smelled like industrial detergent based on the feeling that something was wrong with no actual evidence that anything was wrong. That voice was loud, and it wasn't entirely incorrect. She almost got up twice. The second time, she actually stood, picked up her bag and got as far as the door before she thought about the contracts again. The signatures that had been there. That she had checked. That were now gone. She went back and sat down on the bunk. She lay awake for a long time after that. Somewhere past midnight a thought surfaced that she couldn't push back down. The contracts hadn't been tampered with to embarrass her. They'd been tampered with because someone needed her not to ask about them. And if someone was running fraudulent paperwork through a 5-person bookkeeping firm, the most useful person in that operation was the one who processed the documents without knowing what she was processing. She'd spent 3 months building something small and quiet and workable out of the wreckage of her marriage, and somewhere in the middle of that, without knowing it, she had walked straight into someone else's scheme. The job she'd taken because no one would ask questions. The anonymity she'd wanted so badly. It had made her exactly the kind of person they needed. She almost went home. That's the part I keep coming back to. She almost talked herself out of it. The phone woke her at 4 in the morning. She grabbed it off the floor where she'd set it and saw Wendy's name on the screen. Leigh. Wendy's voice was tight in a way she'd never heard before. Your building is on fire. It's on the news right now. 3rd and 4th floors. Are you there? Are you inside? Leigh was already sitting up. No. I'm at the hostel. I told you. Oh, thank God. A shaky exhale. They're showing it live. It looks bad. Leigh, it looks really bad. She was dressed and out the door in 4 minutes. The cab she called was there in 3 more. She gave the driver her address in the Highlands and sat in the back seat watching Louisville move past the windows, the streets mostly empty at this hour. Traffic lights cycling through their colors for no one. She didn't say anything. The driver didn't ask. She smelled it before she saw it. That particular combination of burning wood and something sharper underneath, chemical, synthetic. The cab turned onto her street, and she saw the lights. First 2 fire trucks angled in front of the building, their red and white strobes cutting through the dark. A police cruiser was parked sideways across the near lane. A small crowd had gathered on the opposite sidewalk, neighbors in coats pulled over pajamas, a few people with phones raised. Leigh paid the driver and got out. The 4th floor was gutted. The windows on her side of the building were black holes, the frames scorched outward, and the brick above each one was streaked dark with soot. The firefighters were still working, 2 hoses running steady streams up into what was left, but the flames themselves were mostly down. What remained was smoke rising in slow columns into the night sky, and the sound of water hitting something that was already gone. A woman from the 3rd floor, Mrs. Donovan, who Leigh had exchanged maybe a dozen words within 2.5 months, was standing near the police tape in a bathrobe, a blanket around her shoulders, talking to a paramedic. Leigh learned later that she and her husband had made it out through the stairwell with burns on their hands and arms. They'd been taken to University of Louisville Medical Center before Leigh arrived. Their unit was directly below hers. A young patrol officer came over with a notepad and asked her name, her unit number, whether she'd been home. She told him she'd been at a friend's place. He wrote it down, said she was lucky, and moved on to the next person. She stood across the street for a long time after that. The sky went from black to gray to the flat colorless light that comes just before sunrise. The hoses kept running. The smoke kept rising. She didn't move. Her apartment was on the 4th floor. The fire investigator would later say the accelerant concentration was highest directly outside her unit. She was supposed to be in that room. She hadn't cried in the cab. She didn't cry now. She just stood there on the sidewalk with her phone in both hands and May Hollis's voice going around and around in her head, the same 6 words, quiet and certain, "Don't go home tonight." It was almost morning. May had told her to come back. May had said she would show her everything. Leigh walked the 20 minutes from her building to the transit center because she didn't want to wait for a cab and she needed the movement. She arrived just after 7. The morning commute was picking up people pushing through the transit center doors, coffee cups in hand, nobody looking at anything except their phones or the middle distance. May was in her spot. She looked up when Leigh got close, and something in her expression shifted, not surprise, not relief exactly, but the particular settling of someone who had been waiting to see which way a thing would go and now knew. She nodded once slowly. Leigh crouched down in front of her. "You told me to come back," she said. "I'm here." May didn't say anything right away. She reached into the worn canvas bag beside her and took out a phone, cheap prepaid, the kind sold at drugstores for $20. She held it out. Leigh took it and looked at the screen. The photos were bad. Dark, grainy, shot at an angle from a distance with no stabilization. But they were enough. The first few showed the rear exterior of her building. She recognized the shape of the back wall, the placement of the basement door, the old light fixture above it that had been flickering for months. 2 men. One of them was carrying a gas can, the kind sold at any hardware store, red plastic with a yellow spout. They were moving toward the basement entrance, not rushing, not looking around. Comfortable. Like they'd been there before. She swiped forward. More frames. The basement door opened, then closed. A gap where May had apparently stopped photographing. Then the men coming back out, one of them now carrying what looked like a second can, moving toward the building's side stairwell entrance. May told her quietly that she had heard footsteps going up through the stairwell after that, 2 sets moving fast. Before both men came running back out through the same door less than 5 minutes later. They left the cans behind somewhere, on the upper floors. The fire started almost immediately after they cleared the building. May had gone to every door she could reach and knocked and yelled until lights started coming on. Leigh kept swiping through the photos. Near the end of the sequence, one of the men turned toward the street, checking the instinctive look back of someone doing something they know is wrong. The light from the old fixture caught the left side of his face for 1 frame. She stopped. Bobby Crane. She stared at the image for several seconds. The angle was imperfect and the resolution was poor, but she had sat 20 feet from this man for 6 weeks. She knew the set of his jaw, the way his head sat on his shoulders. May said she'd seen him walking near that block several evenings in the past 2 weeks, and once close enough that she could hear he'd said Leigh's name. Leigh's not going to be a problem much longer. May Hollis had been invisible to that street for months. Nobody looked at her. That invisibility is the only reason Leigh Calloway is alive to tell this story. Leigh stood up slowly, the phone still in her hand. She thought about the documents she'd emailed herself from work over the past 2 months, reports, reconciliation files, a few contract sets she'd wanted to double-check from home. They were still in her inbox. She hadn't looked at them in weeks. She needed to find a police station. The Louisville Metro Police Department's main building on Jefferson Street had the specific atmosphere of a place that processed difficult things at a steady, unhurried pace. Leigh walked in a little before 8 in the morning, still in the same clothes she'd worn to work the day before, and told the officer at the front desk that she needed to file a report on an attempted murder. He looked at her for a moment, picked up his phone and made a call. Detective Aaron Kidd came out to meet her 10 minutes later. Mid-40s, medium build, the kind of unremarkable face that was probably useful in his line of work. He brought her back to a small office, set a legal pad on the desk between them and told her to start from the beginning. She did. May's warning Monday morning. Crane's question about her neighborhood, Pruitt and the altered contracts. The decision to book the hostel. The 4 in the morning phone call from Wendy. The fire. May's photographs and the frame where the light caught Crane's face. She laid it out in the order it happened, and Kidd wrote things down without interrupting, asking a clarifying question only when something needed pinning down, a date, a name, a specific location. When she finished, he picked up May's phone, looked through the photos himself, and placed it in an evidence bag. He wrote out a receipt and slid it across the desk. "Where are you staying?" he asked. "With a friend. Wendy Pruitt. She's in Germantown." He wrote that down too. "Go there. I'll be in touch." Wendy met her at the door of her apartment on Goss Avenue with a look on her face that was equal parts relief and alarm. She made coffee without asking and sat across from Leigh at the kitchen table while Leigh opened her laptop and pulled up her email. She'd sent herself work files a dozen times over the past 2.5 months, reports she wanted to review at home, contract sets that hadn't balanced on the first pass, a few reconciliation tables she'd needed to cross-check against older records. Now she opened the March financial summary she'd forwarded to herself 6 weeks ago and started reading through the line items. It was in the vendor payments. A disbursement of $87,000 to Crestline Consulting LLC logged under professional services. Leigh stared at it. She remembered processing that payment. Pruitt had handed her the paperwork himself and told her it was a specialized contractor they used quarterly. She hadn't questioned it. She looked up Crestline Consulting LLC in Kentucky's business registry. Registered 26 months ago. Stated capital of $1,000. Registered agent address, a residential unit in Shively, a neighborhood on Louisville's west side. No business website. No listed phone number. No employees on record. The registered agent on file was a man named Stan Whitlow. She sat with that for a moment before she called Kid. Not because she doubted what she was looking at, the filing was as thin as a shell company gets, but because she was thinking about what it meant to call a detective and tell him her employer was running a fraud scheme with her name on the paperwork from a job she'd taken 2.5 months ago with no questions asked. If she was wrong or if she couldn't prove it, she knew exactly how that story would look. She called anyway. Kid answered on the second ring and told her to forward everything she had, the financial summary, anything else from those months that looked irregular. She sent it all within the hour. That evening, Louisville Metro executed a search warrant on Bluegrass Financial Services. Pruitt's desktop computer and 2 years of physical financial records were seized. Kid called her at 9:15 to tell her that preliminary review of the files suggested somewhere between $4 and $5 million had moved through a series of shell companies. Crestline among them, all three registered under the same agent, Stan Whitlow, who appeared to have been collecting a cut on every transfer. Gerald Pruitt had been brought in for questioning and was denying knowledge of any fraudulent activity. Bobby Crane, full name Robert Allen Crane, prior armed robbery conviction released 4 years ago, was not at his registered address. A warrant had been issued. For the first time since 4 in the morning, she felt like something was moving in the right direction. It was a small feeling, but it was real. She closed the laptop and looked at Wendy, who had been sitting across the table through the entire phone call, pretending to scroll through her phone and doing a poor job of it. "They're looking for him," Leigh said. Wendy nodded. "Good," she said, and meant it simply, without decoration, which was exactly what Leigh needed to hear. Wednesday passed slowly. Leigh spent most of it on Wendy's couch, doing the small administrative work of a life that had been interrupted, calling her renter's insurance company to start the claims process, texting her landlord, making a list of documents she'd need to replace. Her driver's license, her social security card, her bank cards. Everything had been in the apartment. She worked through the list methodically because it gave her something to do with her hands and kept her from thinking too hard about anything else. Kid called at 7:30 that evening. Stan Whitlow had given a full statement. Pruitt had been running the cash extraction scheme for just over 2 years, cycling money through Crestline and 2 other shells with the same structure, minimal capital, residential addresses. No legitimate operations. Whitlow had served as the registered agent on all 3, handling the paperwork in exchange for a percentage of every transfer. He was a financial middleman, not an arsonist. His role was to make the money movement look clean on paper. The total that had moved through the network came to between $4 and $4.5 million. Pruitt was being formally charged with criminal fraud and attempted murder under Kentucky state law, with the case set for Jefferson County Circuit Court. He was still denying any involvement in the fire, still insisting he'd had no idea the books were irregular. Kid said this without particular expression, and then said that Pruitt's own phone had been pulled as part of the warrant. On it was a text sent to Whitlow that same Monday afternoon, roughly 40 minutes after Pruitt had come into Leigh's office with the folder of unsigned contracts. The message read, "Take care of the accountant problem tonight. Whitlow, When confronted with it, confirmed that he had understood that to mean Pruitt wanted Crane activated. Crane had been on Pruitt's payroll as more than a security guard for some time. The arrangement predated Leigh's hiring by over a year. Leigh was quiet for a moment. "That's the same afternoon he came to ask me about the contracts," she said. "Yes," Kid said. "It is." She didn't sleep well that night. But she slept. Kid called again Thursday morning just before 8. Bobby Crane had been picked up at the Greyhound terminal on Muhammad Ali Boulevard at 5 in the morning, attempting to board an early bus to Nashville. He'd had a bag packed and a one-way ticket. He gave a statement within the hour. Pruitt had paid him $100,000 in cash to set the fire. Crane had brought a man named Dale Mims as a second set of hands. Mims was arrested at his apartment in Newburgh 2 hours after Crane's statement was taken. Both men were in custody. Leigh said thank you, and Kid said he'd be in touch about next steps, and she hung up. She was still sitting on Wendy's couch. At some point in the last 60 seconds, she had started crying, not the kind that announces itself, just the kind that arrives when something that has been held very tightly finally doesn't need to be held anymore. Wendy came in from the kitchen, sat down beside her, and put an arm around her shoulders. She didn't say anything. She just stayed there. She'd spent 3 days not knowing if the person who tried to kill her was still out there. When Kid said they had Crane, she didn't feel triumphant. She just felt tired in a way that meant it was finally safe to be tired. The 2 weeks after the arrests were administrative and exhausting in equal measure. Leigh filed the renter's insurance claim, gathered what documentation she could reconstruct, and waited. She updated her resume from Wendy's kitchen table and started sending it out. Heartland Distribution Group called back within 10 days, a mid-size regional company, legitimate operation, in-house accounting team that needed a senior bookkeeper. She interviewed on a Tuesday, got the offer by Thursday. $52,000 to start, 62 after a 90-day review. She said yes. She and Wendy found a 2-bedroom in Germantown 3 weeks later, a clean older building 2 blocks from a bus line, a landlord who responded to emails within the hour. They signed the lease together and moved in over a weekend with what between the two of them amounted to a modest pile of furniture and a lot of goodwill. The renter's insurance payout came through 6 weeks after that. $65,000 for total contents loss. Leigh put most of it in savings, bought a bed frame and a dresser, and didn't think too hard about what she'd lost. The case against Pruitt, Crane, Mims, and Whitlow moved through Jefferson County Circuit Court that fall. Leigh testified on a Wednesday morning, sitting across the courtroom from Gerald Pruitt, who looked smaller than she remembered, older. The confidence that had always read as mild distraction now entirely absent. She told the truth in the order it happened and answered every follow-up question without hesitation. The verdicts came back within 2 days. Pruitt 8 years. Crane 10. Mims 7. Whitlow 4 years probation. In exchange for his cooperation and full testimony. In the weeks that followed sentencing, Pruitt's attorney contacted Leigh to ask if she'd be willing to meet briefly at the jail. She almost said no. She went anyway. They sat on opposite sides of a visitation partition, and Pruitt picked up the phone on his side and looked at her for a moment before he spoke. He said he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He said he knew her name before she ever walked through his door. Wendy's friend, the one going through a divorce, needed something quiet for a while. He'd hired her because she fit what he needed, not because he'd thought about what it would cost her. He said that out loud to her face, and she could see it was the hardest part of what he'd come to say. Leigh told him she couldn't forgive him. But she could see he meant what he said. She left without the bitterness she'd expected to carry out with her. She'd made a promise to May the morning after the fire, and she hadn't forgotten it. Kid connected her with a contact at a state-contracted facility on Louisville's south side called Riverside Manor. Clean hallways, a common room with good light, a small garden visible from the ground floor windows. The director, Patricia Odom, walked Leigh through the intake process and had a room available within the week. Leigh handled the paperwork, drove to the transit center one last time to pick May up, and took her there on a Thursday afternoon. She'd bought May 2 changes of clothes, a warm robe, slippers, and a bag of toiletries the day before. May had looked at the bag like it was something she didn't have a category for. When Patricia showed May her room, a single modest with a window that faced the garden, the old woman stood in the middle of it and cried without making any sound. Leigh stood beside her and didn't try to fill it with words. May settled in slowly, and then all at once. Within 2 months she'd gained back weight she'd lost over years of living outside. She joined the facility's weekly card group and by November was singing in a small choir that performed at the monthly community dinner. She looked, Patricia told Leigh during one of her Sunday visits, like a different person. Sandra Hollis showed up in October. May's estranged daughter had driven down from Cincinnati after a long silence carrying a bag of gifts and an apology she'd clearly been rehearsing. The reconciliation wasn't simple. 2 hours in May's room, both of them crying at different points. Sandra explaining the shame that had made her pull away and May listening with the patience of someone who had already made her peace with most of it. They didn't fix everything that afternoon, but Sandra started calling once a week, and she came back the following month and the one after that. May told Leigh about it on a Sunday visit in November, sitting at the small table in her room with 2 cups of tea between them. "You didn't just save me," she said. "You reminded my daughter what it looks like to show up for someone." Leigh's 36th birthday fell on a Saturday in early December. In the hour before the guests arrived, she stood alone in the kitchen of the Germantown apartment, filling glasses with water, setting out napkins, doing the small preparatory work of someone expecting people she actually wanted to see. It was an ordinary thing. She'd done it before in other kitchens in another life. But standing there that evening, she noticed something she couldn't quite name at first: the absence of the waiting feeling. The sense she'd carried since the divorce of inhabiting her own life provisionally, like a tenant who hasn't decided whether to renew. It wasn't gone entirely, but it was quieter than it had been in a long time. Wendy came in from the other room and asked if she needed help, and Leigh said no and meant it. The guests arrived. Leigh's co-workers from Heartland came. May came with Sandra, who turned out to be quieter than Leigh had expected and genuinely warm once the formality wore off. At some point in the evening, May stood up with her glass and gave a toast. She didn't speak loudly or for very long. She said that she had spent the last part of her life believing the world had mostly stopped being kind and that she had been wrong about that, and that she was grateful to have found out before it was too late. Then she said goodness doesn't always come back the same day, but it always comes back. Leigh looked around the table, Wendy refilling glasses, Sandra laughing at something, the candles burning low. A year ago, she had been waking up alone in a new apartment, heading to a job she didn't yet know would nearly kill her, dropping spare change into an old woman's cup on the way. A small thing, the smallest thing. She hadn't known then what it would come back as. If you passed May every morning on your way to work, just an old woman sitting quietly near the door, would you have stopped to drop something in that cup? Or would you have walked past, like everyone else did?